Where the woods, where the woods, where the woods at? Have the satyrs sneaking up where them wolves at? Oh, them neighbors acting up, chewing a growth at. You better patrol us out if you're gonna try that. Where the woods, where the woods, where the woods at? Here come the Minotaur with his bronze axe. Them centaurs trotting up, call them dryads. Better hide your button, they don't like that. That's right. We speak for the trees. And we are pissed. Hello, and welcome to another Dominion 6 National Overview. In this one we're going to be going over Early Age Pangea, the Age of Revelry. Early Age Pangea is a woodland nation inhabited by half-men. We're talking centaurs, satyrs, minotaurs, harpies, as well as the elusive Pan. These forces have banded together to try and protect the forests from the encroachment of civilization. The nation of Pangea has access to all of these forest beings, and they also have a lot of stealthy troops which allows them to sneak around before and after battle, and also most of their units, in fact pretty much all of them, are able to heal battle afflictions outside of battle thanks to the recuperation feat. This means that you can take less attrition from things like having crippled units on the march, as well as just making sure that all of your sacreds, as well as your heavy hitting troops, are acting at top efficiency in between battles. As far as their military goes, as said, they have their access to their satyrs and the minotaurs, as well as centaur warriors, as well as archers for some ranged action as well. As far as their magic, they're a very heavily focused on nature magic nation, as well as having some access to both earth, glamour and blood, as well as some very small access to water. Additionally, they also have access to some national spells with their magical tunes, which allow their level 1 nature mages to make quite an impact on the battlefield. As far as the priests go, they are average, however they are able to perform blood sacrifices, with the highest they're able to recruit nationally being at Holy 2. As far as their scales and blesses go, they have a +1 to their turmoil limit and a +1 to their growth limit, both of which can be quite handy depending on your tactics. When it comes to buildings, they have a lower infrastructure costs in forests for both temples and labs, both of which only costing 300 gold. However, their forts are primitive for the early age, which means you're only able to get one commander point out of those forts, and they are 50% more expensive, which is quite costly. However, they do have a way around this, which we'll go over in the national spell section. So let's go over the races of Early Age Pangea. As stated before, all of their races have access to recuperation, which allows them to heal afflictions outside of battle, very good for making sure that they're fighting fit on the campaign. They also have access to forest survival, which means they're able to use their okay map move on some units and very good map move on others to move around forests very, very easily. This means that you can actually multi-move sneak through multiple provinces at a time, especially on your centaurs. Additionally, all of your units have higher magic resistance than a normal human, which is pretty nice for protecting them against spells. For your size 3 units, you first got the harpies, which are stealthy and also able to fly. They're fairly fragile, but we'll go into more of that in the troop section. Whereas your satyrs, also being size 3, they're also stealthy, most of them. Some of them aren't, with the warriors, and they're unable to fly. Effectively, they're just slightly stronger humans with a little bit more HP, but they're usually not wearing very many clothes. Moving on to your next race, you have the centaurs, who are size 5 stealthy and strong units, who are also incredibly fast both in combat and on the map. This makes them into a very effective raiding force, as they're able to move around stealthily very quickly through multiple provinces every turn, especially when combined with their forest survival and forest provinces. Whereas your minotaurs, they're also size 4, they are tramplers, which has its benefits and its drawbacks, but they're also berserkers and they're also pretty strong. We'll go into the advantages and disadvantages of this more when we talk about the units. Speaking of units, let's have a look at your recruitable troops as Early Age Pangea. As Early Age Pangea, you have options for a lot of stealthy raiders. Most of your units have some form of stealth, with the exception of the more heavily armoured warriors usually, but that doesn't mean that you're able to move around the map, able to concentrate your forces or hide your forces so the enemy doesn't know where they are, which can be very useful for both scaring people off in multiplayer and kind of directing their attention elsewhere while you have units sneaking through their lands. Additionally, not only in combat, you have some pretty interesting tactics that you can use with one of your units, which we'll go over in a second. Your Sacred, the White Centaur, is a very solid Sacred option, probably one of the better Sacreds in the game in my opinion, but again we'll go over them more on their actual unit card. Additionally, as Early Age Pangea, you have lots of foreign recruitment available in Forest. You can recruit most of your basic units in Forest, which is great for being able to supplement your forces early and allows you to build up more troops than other nations would be able to in the early game. making it so that you're able to do an early war fairly effectively. As for a drawback for your units, most of your troops lack helmets or a shield, or in some cases any armor at all really. This means that massed enemy range firepower can do a lot of damage to your troops, especially slings, given the lack of helmets for a lot of your guys. You gotta watch out for that sling head bonk. Let's go over your first troop, the lowly Harpy. The Harpy is a pretty cheap flying unit, but does have access to a multi-attack. The multi-attack isn't great, with their 2 talons only having attack skill 8, and doing not great damage at damage 9. However, because you can fit 3 of these guys to a square, that's still a lot of attacks coming out of a single square. They can fly, they're stealthy, they're very useful against archers, especially if they're not very well armoured. So if you're fighting an opponent that's using a bunch of indie archers, hey, you can use them. Just expect a lot of attrition. They don't really have the stats to stand up to anything. Otherwise, your main use for these guys is actually going to be using them as patrollers. They make very effective patrollers thanks to the fact that they're flying, which means that they have pretty good patrolling strength, although their lower precision than normal does hurt that ever so slightly. Alternatively, you can use them instead to help you in sieges, both offensively and defensively. They're pretty good defensively thanks to the fact they're flying, which means that even though they have slightly lower strength than a normal human, they actually perform quite well for defending your castles. Additionally, they're also quite good on the offense, purely because they can, again, fly, which makes them more effective than some other units. They're probably your most cost-effective sieger out of all of your units. Add on to this that they're stealthy, they can fly, and they have a really high map move. These Harpies make a great addition to your roster. Next we'll move on to the Satyr Sneak. Armed with a bronze spear, as well as some fur armour, who is stealthy, they cause unrest, they're undisciplined, but they are foreign recruitable in all forests. These guys are undisciplined, which is a little bit of a shame. It means that you can't script them, and it means they're more likely just going to charge at whatever they're going to fight, and then just die. They're not too expensive, being 9 gold, but you don't have a shield, and you don't have a helmet, and your protection's pretty lacking even with your basic furs. This means these guys aren't really the best in combat, just due to their equipment. Sure, they can do a bit of damage with a bronze spear, but they're not really outshining anybody else in the age, and you're going to probably lose a lot of them. Additionally, they have a 9 morale, so they're probably going to run pretty quick, so probably keeping them out of combat is a better idea. The main benefit of these guys is they are very stealthy. Plus 60 stealth on a normal troop is very, very high. This means it's far harder for enemy patrollers to find them, which means they're able to stay stealth for longer, which goes into their other ability, which is to increase unrest in the province they're in. Every single Satyr Sneak will increase the unrest in the province that they are in by 0.5. So if you had, 10 of them, then that's increasing unrest by 5 every single month while they're there. That's a really difficult force to pick out without some kind of magical aid, or without potentially using some magical items to assist with patrolling, or the enemy having to dedicate an exceptionally large patrolling force in order to find you. This means that you can use these guys to damage the enemy's economy without even having to take the province by just massively increasing the unrest. And additionally, if you go to a province and you find out that, oh, there's not actually that much province defense here, you could probably use these guys against some basic province defense. Let's say if they only had like 5 or 6 PD level, they can probably take that out if you have enough of them. Just expect a couple of bits of attrition. Going on next, we have the Satyr. Very similar to the Satyr Sneaks, but however they have an added javelin on top of their bronze spear, but they're also lacking in furs. They're not quite as stealthy as the Sneaks, and they're still undisciplined, however. So it doesn't mean you can't use them for unrest bombs, and they're more likely to be found by patrollers. I honestly would say these guys aren't as good as the warriors, but the best thing is that they're cheap, and you can recruit them out of all of your forests. If you are looking for a cheap troop though, the Harpies are cheaper if you want a bit more of a damage dealer, but these guys perform better as a chaff screen, so use these guys as undisciplined chaff screen, with maybe a little bit of backup from some of your lowlier mages, either back casting things like Sermon of Courage on them, or using some of your magical tunes. Next up we have the Satyr Warrior, which is a disciplined version of the Satyr armed with a bronze spear and a shield this time, who loses his ability to sneak around. This means they can help with raids, but they are more of a frontline force. Unfortunately, they're quite expensive and they have a high RP cost, even if the resources cost isn't that bad in comparison to some of your other troops. This means that they aren't easily massable. You're probably better to use independent forces as heavies if possible. Even something like a light infantry, probably better than these guys. The main benefit they have over them is they have actually decent skills for a basic-ish troop, and fairly high HP as well, and magic resistance. So if you want to go an order productivity build with these guys, hey, you know what, go nuts. Finally, for the Satyrs, we have the Revelers, which are basically upgraded sneakers. They're more expensive than them, both in terms of RP and gold, but for that you get Berserk, and you also get better stats. You do also lose Forest Recruitment, unfortunately. They're actually a perfectly passable unit, but they're still not great in comparison to some of the other options that you have. They're quite expensive for their admittedly pretty okay stats, and they have roles performed better by other units in your roster. For your Unrest creators, you have your Sneaks. For your dedicated Raider force, you have your Centaurs. I would say you can still use these guys if you want to be able to use them as both an Unrest bomber on top of using them as Raiders, or even just sort of like use them to assist your other better troops, say like your Centaur warriors and such. They can do pretty well for filling up a chaff screen and actually doing some damage as well. One thing they are quite nice is if they do go Berserk, which they probably will because they have 15 hit points, they do have 2 attacks as well, which does make them quite dangerous. Moving on to your Centaurs, first of all you have the aforementioned Centaur, who is a stealthy, forest recruited unit that has a longbow as well as a bronze dagger. These guys are fast, high damage archers. They have a high strength and they have a high precision, meaning they're more likely to hit, and they also use a longbow which does more damage and has a further range than most bows in the age. This gives them a nice range advantage and damage advantage over other archers. However, they are quite expensive for archers at 25 gold a pop. Although they do have 20 HP each, they're size 5 as well, so you only got 2 on a square, makes it hard to buff them as well. Because they have no protection, only having a natural protection of 3, you will lose archer duels with these guys. They're going to be more spread out, so the arrows that go astray are more likely to hit something. They have no protection, so whenever they get hit, they're going to take damage, you're going to get afflictions, which admittedly they do recuperate, which is nice, but enough shots hit, these guys are going to die, you've got absolutely no protection to help you. Additionally, they do have multi-attack with their hoof and their bronze dagger, but you probably don't want these guys in close combat with anything, with any kind of equipment, because they will probably just die. Still, they are fairly cheap and quite stealthy raiders. Next up we have the Centauride, which is basically just a female version of the Centaur, with the same stealthiness for forest recruitment, but armed with a short bow rather than a long bow. They have better precision than the Centaur, but they have less strength, so it does mean they're losing out a little bit in terms of the range advantage the Centaurs have, as well as a little bit of damage. The precision is quite nice if you want to have them as more precise archers for actually dealing damage from further away enemies, but because they lack a shield and they still only have 3 protection, they're still going to lose in archer duels, unfortunately. As well as that, but having lower strength does make them worse in melee, but they still do have 2 attacks, which is quite nice. Other than that, they cost the same, slightly lower HP as well. I'd say probably just stick with the Centaurs. Next for the Centaurs we have access to the Centauride Warrior, which is an armoured Centauride. They lose their bow, but instead they get a spear and a javelin, and a shield, which is great. They're still stealthy, however they can no longer be recruited in forests. They are still very fast units in combat with 31 combat speed and 20 map movement, even with the additional armour. These are probably some of your best raiders. The javelins can help against the bigger units, and they're slightly cheaper than Centaur warriors. Very good for your expansion parties before you have access to more resources. Next up though, we have the Centaur Warrior, a stealthy, berserking, armoured Centaur, very similar to the Centauride Warrior. However, they are slightly more expensive than them, because you lose the javelin, you get more strength, you get Berserker +3, and a helmet. Fantastic. In my opinion, the 5 gold difference between them and the Centauride Warrior is very much worth the difference. They're very good against high defense units with their Berserk, which boosts their attack skill up quite high with both the Bronze Lance and their Hoof. Use these guys as your raiders once you've got a little bit more cash behind you, and they can become a pretty good center force for your armies. Up next we have the Minotaurs, size 4 tramplers with Berserk, Trample, Undisciplined, Forest Recruitment, as well as Recuperation for Survival, and the extra magic resistance. These guys are pretty gold expensive, but they're cheap otherwise, both in terms of resources and recruitment points, and the fact that they're forest recruitment means you can get a lot of these guys pretty quickly if you need to. The unfortunate thing with these guys is they are undisciplined berserkers, which will usually get themselves killed. They'll trample into human lines, and then they just try and trample them. They'll either fatigue out, or they'll just die because they've just gone straight in, and they've left themselves open to being attacked by like a bajillion guys on every side. Where they are more useful is against high HP or protection units, so things like giants for example, they actually do pretty well because they won't be trampling, and instead will just be hitting them with a bronze axe, which, when it hits, does 28 damage before they go berserk. Pretty good in my opinion. Still, they pale in comparison to their more armoured counterpart. Speaking of which, next up we have the Minotaur Warrior, who loses out on the forest recruitment of his unarmoured brother, but he still has Berserker at a slightly higher value at +5, he's still got Trample, And as well, he's still got his battle axe, as well as a leather hauberk, which is quite nice. He's still a size 4 trampling berserker, which does mean that he does have the same issue as his other counterpart in that he can go up against humans and just get swarmed and die that way. They're also more expensive in terms of gold, going up to 50 gold each, which is quite the investment, as well as 18 recruitment points. The main benefit of these guys over their other minotaurs is they can be given orders, which means they're far easier to actually get to the target that you want them to attack if possible. Having them attack large or attack cavalry is very good order. These guys hit hard with their battle axes, and they actually have a slightly better attack skill as well. When they go berserk, they hit exceptionally hard. You're talking about 34 damage with their bronze battle axe, just base, and all of a sudden their attack skill goes up to 14, which means with their battle axe they're actually hitting at 15. Very, very good for use against giants and protection thugs, and with their 10 protection that they have, they'll actually last a little bit longer as well. Very useful to have these guys more of as a hit force if you know you're going to be going up against thugs or even potentially pretender gods, to try and use them to take them down. Otherwise, you would love to make these guys your frontliners, but they're just not quite good enough. Okay, let's move on to your sacred. The sacred for Early Age Pangea is the White Centaur, a capital only sacred who is stealthy, who's a berserker, as well as having probably some of the best collections of stats and equipment of potentially even any sacred in the game. Very good for the early age, just very good in general. They are very similar to the Centaur warriors, but they're very similar to the Centaur warriors who are already pretty good, but they can also take a bless, even better. They have really good stats, they're really fast, and they have very good equipment, especially for your nation, although the protection does leave something to be desired. If you use a very heavy bless them with the fact they can go berserk, the fact they're stealthy, and you have leaders who can also lead them stealthily while still blessing them, these guys become a pretty oppressive hit force. They're 55 gold each, which is pretty expensive, as well as 29 RP, but for sacreds, it's honestly not that bad. The only bad thing about them is they are cap only, so you can't recruit them out of other forts, but if you just recruit your Centaur warriors, they can be used to back up your white centaurs while you're out expanding. Okay, so that's just gone over your troops. What to consider from that? You have lots of foreign recruitable troops, but they're kind of meh. This allows you to actually just mass out a lot of okay units to use early, where quantity is a part of its own quality. This means that in early wars you can just outproduce most other nations, so you can sit on the opponent's capital while you just take out all of their other surrounding provinces and then win the battle that way. They're very able to raid with all of the stealthy choices. You have lots of choices for stealthy units to choose from. This can give you a lot of tactical flexibility in choosing which battles to fight, as well as obviously having the additional access to things like unrest bombs, and thanks to your high map move on your centaurs, you can strike in places the opponent might not be expecting you to do so. Your Centaur warriors are probably the best mundane units in your nation. Only downsides with them obviously is you don't have any foreign recruitment, and they are quite expensive, but for what you get they are pretty hard hitters, they're very fast, and they're able to move around the map very quickly. If you don't want to use them, you could always use your revelers as well for a still fairly expensive but still cheaper force that can go around. They can sneak quite well, and they'll still cause unrest kind of behind enemy lines. You really want to play as Pangea as a bit more of a sneaky faction rather than trying to fight somebody on the front line to get critical pieces of infrastructure rather than just fighting over territories that connect you. Your Minotaur warriors are very effective shock troops, at least in my mind. They can be effective against small groups of infantry, although obviously they can die if they just charge into them, only being size 4, but they're also very, very good at taking out high HP, high protection units. Get small groups of Minotaur warriors on attack large enemies or attack cavalry, depending on what target you want them to go for, and with the damage on their battle axe, they can absolutely cleave through them. On top of this, you have some nice utility from your flying patrollers and your harpy, which don't cost that much, and also your unrest causing sneaks and revelers give you a nice little bit of utility on top of just frontline damage. Okay, let's move on to your commanders. So with your commanders, you have a good selection of stealthy commanders and mages. As far as your magic goes, you are very heavily nature-based, with some glamour and some earthy, as well as a little bit of blood access, but it's on your most expensive mage. You additionally have access to one of the best scouts in the game, which we'll go into in a little bit. On top of that, you have some assassination options with your dryads, but you are lacking a good, cheap leader. You do have a pretty okay leader, who is very useful for leading out raiding parties, but they're not as cheap as some other nations have. Okay, moving on to your first commander, you have the Black Harpy, a flying, stealthy, forest recruitable commander, who is a very stealthy and very cheap scout. They're probably one of the best scouts in the game, just purely because they can fly, they have ridiculously high map move, and they're also exceptionally stealthy. This makes them really good for getting information, especially getting early information so you can find a target for your first war so you know who you're going to fight on, and also for finding new forest province for you to work towards in your expansion. Next up for your commanders, we have the Satyr Commander, a stealthy, okay commander that can be useful for leading out groups of your satyrs, but isn't potentially the best leader for you to use. The stealth is really the only main difference from like an independent commander. They can't lead that many units and they don't have any kind of bonuses to your troops either, and they are fort recruit only. Are they really worth one of your fort turns? That's kind of up to you. However, they are needed for stealthy unrest parties, so they do have their niche out of all of you. Next up we have the Minotaur Lord, who is a commander version of your Minotaur warriors, who has high berserk at +5, he's a trampler, and he's also forest recruitable. They can make okay, quick anti-thugs that don't require fort turns, especially with just a small 5 gem investment for like a basic two-handed weapon. They can do okay with that. They're also okay leaders, they're able to lead more troops than the satyrs, but you do have better options. Unfortunately, the fact that they're berserkers doesn't mean that the enemy can use it against them. One stray arrow, suddenly your commander's berserk, charges in, dies, you have no other commanders, and all your army just flees. Not great. While you might look at them and think, oh, these guys would make great thugs, unfortunately, without heavy gem investment, they just aren't that great. They're basically like a worse troglodyte lord. You could give them some armor for a 10 gem investment for both your armor and your head. It's just too high for what you get. They're just going to encumber themselves out, and then they'll just die. You've got better uses for thugs, anyway. Speaking of which, let's move on to your mages. The first of which is the Centaur Hierophant, a stealthy, inspirational mage who is sacred and is able to be recruited in forests, and you have a 100% chance for +1 in Earth or Nature Paths, as well as 1 in their Holy Path. These guys are the workhorse of your nation. They have low levels of paths, but they're very good for their roles. Nature Paths make okay researchers if you want to keep them behind, but they can also make very good army leaders as well. Another note to think about researchers is these guys are very good, especially if you have magic scales. They're not that expensive, they're the cheapest mage that you can produce, and they have decent research. If you manage to random an Earth path, however, they make pretty good army thugs. They're able to bless themselves and give themselves some additional protection, and if you want to give them a couple of gems of equipment on top of that, they make far better thugs than your Minotaurs. The fact that they're stealthy and a good leader makes them very useful. They're also a stealthy preacher, only at level 1, but it does unlock the option of having these guys lead your sneaks. It is much more expensive. You can also preach your dominion in order to replace their dominion with yours, which if you've already got turmoil in there, even better. Other than that, they make okay leaders, but they're very useful for leading your stealthy raiding parties, having a high map move so they can keep up with your centaurs, and they can also lead sacreds and bless them thanks to the fact they're Holy One, as well as casting a couple of buffs depending on what pass you get. All this with a pretty good package, with pretty good stats, although maybe lacking a little bit in protection, and you've got a very good chassis for a light thug. Next up we have the Centaur Hierophantide, who is a stealthy, inspirational, sacred unit who is able to be forest recruited, and they have Holy One with an 100% chance for +1 in either water or nature. These ladies are basically the female version of the Hierophant, and in my opinion, they're not quite as good. Their equipment is worse, they've got a short bow instead of a long. The nature randoms are basically identical, so they can make good researchers in that kind of respect, but the water randoms do open up some more spells for you to use, but overall I don't think they're quite as good as Earth for some thugging paths. Later on though, if you've got a couple of them, you can use it for things like Frozen Heart spam, which is pretty nice for use as anti-thugs, and they can also be sacred buffers with a little bit of gems. Give them some water gems, start casting quickness on some white centaurs, you'll get some use out of that. In my opinion, a bit more niche than the Centaur leader, but you choose yours. Next up for mages we have the Dryad, a Nature 1 and Glamour 1 mage with Holy 2, who is stealthy, has all 4, is sacred, can seduce enemies, and is also a Beastmaster. The Dryad is a very good fort mage, and they're also on top of that an okay leader. They can serve and encourage your units, they can do banishments fairly well. Something to keep in mind. They are also a very effective assassin, and one of the reasons why people hate fighting Early Age Pangea. Even though it says they're more of a seducer, which does have its place as well, is also very useful for getting yourself enemy commanders on neighbouring provinces, they're much better assassins. Plus, seduction is morale versus a 9, it's probably going to fail. In an assassin fight, they have all 4 inbuilt, which makes them very effective, and they can also just spam warrior illusions, or you can give them something like an Amulet of the Dead to summon a long dead with them, and most commanders, or at least most mundane commanders, can't really stand up to that. This makes them really good for dealing with commanders before battle. The fact that they're also pretty stealthy and hard to find means you're going to be able to infiltrate your enemy pretty well. Unfortunately, they don't have scale walls, so they won't be as useful in sieges. Probably the main downside though is they are fairly expensive and they're not that great of a researcher for the cost. They only have one level in nature or glamour, but it does allow you to start doing things like elf shot if you want to try and help out your armies. Honestly though, in my mind, stick to using them as assassins rather than army leaders if you want to, just because the Centaur Hierophant is a bit cheaper. Next up we have the Dryad Mother, a more expensive version of the Dryad, who has Nature 2, Glamour 1 and Holy 2, with an 100% chance for +1 in Water, Earth or Glamour, and then a 10% chance for +1 in Water, Earth, Nature or Glamour. They're stealthy, they have all +5, which is even more than the Dryads, they're sacred, they can also seduce, they're not any better. They have Beastmaster and also Ivy Lord 1. For this extra cost, you do get extra paths in comparison to the Dryad, which is nice. Here's also your highest Glamour paths with the Glamour 2 randoms. And Water randoms do put you on track for Foul Vapors, but you will need to do some empowerment or some additional forging in order to get them up there, just with the changes of casting in Dominion 6 for Foul Vapors. When it comes to the Earth randoms, it does make them fairly effective thugs if you want to, but they are outshined by the Pan, and it's an awful lot of gold to be using what is effectively a human chassis for thugging. They are, however, very good Vine summoners for chaff. This includes both the Vine Men and the Vine Ogres, thanks to the fact they're Ivy Lords. And they're probably a bit too expensive for use as seducers, given the fact they're not really any better than the normal Dryads, so use them more to support your armies or to do specific things. They're a bit more niche than your Dryads, but they're still a pretty good mage. Finally, for Early Age Pangea, we have access to the Pan. A slow to recruit, good leader who has Earth 1, Nature 4, Blood 1, with an 100% chance of +1 in Earth or Blood, and then an additional 10% chance of +1 in Earth, Nature or Blood. They're stealthy, they're beast leaders, they have animal awe, they have poison resistance, and additionally they summon Maenads in Turmoil. We'll go over them in a little bit. The main thing you can say about the Pan is they're the most expensive mage that you can recruit. Before this, you get a very powerful caster. They have very high nature levels, even without randoms, and they're able to boost themselves up in Earth using gems or using a random in order to be able to cast more spells in battle. They're also your gateway to some blood, having Blood 1 with a potential for Blood 2 depending on the random. However, they're probably a bit too expensive to get your proper blood economy in comparison to actual blood nations. Their main use comes from having a high leadership, which makes them very useful for leading large groups of disciplined troops so they can use formations, as well as getting army-wide nature buffs off. The fact that they free spawn Maenads in Turmoil means that you also have free chaff to help out your forces if you've gone for that specific kind of build, and they're also able to keep up with most of your stealthy raiders, though they can't quite keep up with your centaurs. Additionally, although expensive, they do make for very effective thugs with some gear, and a little bit of research just thanks to their high levels of paths. They can become quite difficult to deal with. Overall, a very good mage, and probably the one you'll find casting Mother Oak. So what's the Mage Takeaway? Well, you've got a good selection of not overwhelmingly powerful mages, but certainly very good mages. Your Hierophants and your Hierophantides make very good army support casters and researchers, and potentially even some low-level army thugs. Dryads are very good for taking out your enemy commanders before battle using their seduction/assassination, whereas your Pan are your big nature casters with some additional earth power that you can get as well, depending on how many gems you want to invest in them. When it comes to your mages, you have access to the ability to get Freespawn and also summons that will massively help you with the weakness in your troop roster, and that's something you're really going to be wanting to rely on going into the game. Additionally, the fact that you have lower infrastructure costs in Forest, with the fact that you can recruit Centaur mages in Forest, mean that you can make more mages early than other nations and potentially snowball off that. The main downsides are the costs. You're going to be running out of money most of the time as Pangea, not only because of your scales, but from the fact that you're going to be recruiting so many mages and so many troops from a lot of your forest provinces every single turn. This is also the point where I say, remember, when you're moving around your armies and you want to attack, don't accidentally sneak your armies in. Done that far too many times. Because of the fact that all of your commanders are stealthy, other than your Satyr commander, make sure you're actually sneaking when you want to sneak and attacking when you want to attack. Let's quickly go over the Pan Freespawn. So this is the Maenad, who is a berserking, undisciplined unit, who's basically just a naked woman. These Maenads Freespawn from Pans in Turmoil. The fact that they're naked berserking humans is okay. They don't really have the hit points to take a hit, and they have no inbuilt natural protection, but they do have a claw. It does 10 damage, which is alright, and if they do survive the hit, then they do go berserk, which is nice. Overall, you can say they're not great, but they are free. But it's good to just have some additional chaff. You can use them to help protect your mages, just send them up against your enemies. You just got to be a little bit careful that they don't make up the bulk of your force and then cause an HP rout when they all inevitably die, but hopefully they go berserk instead. If you can buff them, just due to the fact that they're size 3, they do take buffs okay, certainly better than some of your other units who are size 5 or size 4. And if you manage to get enough buffs on them, they're actually surprisingly good for Freespawn. I mean, it's basically just another basic troop that you don't have to pay for. If you want them, you can go Turmoil. Equally, you can also go Order and ignore them. It's entirely up to what your god is designed around and what you want to do as a playstyle. Okay, let's go over your only national summon as Early Age Pangea, the Hamadryad, who is an immobile Nature 3 mage summoned at Enchantment 5 with the Awakened Hamadryad spell costing 25 Nature Gems and requiring Nature 4. For that, you get a very strong 110 hit point immobile chassis, who has Fire Weakness, Growth Power, Poison Resistance, as an innate spellcaster, has Blunt Resistance, Pierce Resistance, is a magical being, doesn't need to eat, and also has Forest Survival. Additionally, in battle, they will summon 3d6 harpies to the battle as well. These guys can only be summoned in forests, however, but that does include cave forests. The Hamadryad's an okay summon. With an innate spellcaster, they can cast pretty hard. This gives you a really good defensive Hellcaster in every single one of your forest provinces if you want. This means that you don't have to use pans for it, and it only takes 1 turn to cast, rather than the other normal casting time of about 2.5 rounds. However, they are quite expensive for 25 gems, but given the fact that they have high hit points, decent protection, and are actually a pretty decent nature mage, it makes taking out your forest far more difficult if you're willing to invest 25 nature gems in them. Okay, let's move on to your national heroes, the first of which is the Blessed Couple, who is a Nature 3, Water 1, Earth 1, Holy 2 mage, who is stealthy, unsurroundable, has inbuilt awe, is a berserker, has poison resistance, and is an innate caster, as well as being able to be a Beastmaster, and they're also sacred as well. This is a very powerful 2-form hero who's also a pretty good leader, able to lead 100 people and do formations. The fact as well is that they are a moving innate caster, and while they're not the tankiest at only 23 hit points, this is fantastic for giving you some extra utility when it comes to fights. Very good for doing things like turn 1 howls, because they're innate casters, so they can just do it in 1 turn. Makes them very effective for supporting big fights, especially when the enemy isn't expecting you to just drop a howl very quickly into the battle. On top of that, they have access to a lot of good paths. They have Water 1, which is okay, Earth 1, which you can boost up, as well as their Nature 3, which makes them very good at supporting armies, good for some army-wide buffs, or certainly some large AoE buffs. One downside to them is they can go berserk when they get damage, which does kind of ruin their innate casting a little bit. Overall, a very good leader, keep them safe. You could try and thug them out a little bit with gear, but they probably are too important to do that, so I'd say keep them safe and just use them to support your troops. Now, if the Blessed Couple is killed, then they are replaced with the Grieving Dryad, who is a Holy 2, Water 1, Earth 1, Nature 3, and Death 2 mage, who is a good leader, who is stealthy, has Beastmaster, still has the inbuilt awe, it can seduce, is poison resistant, and is also sacred. The best thing about this hero is they gain 2 death from it, which is great. It's your only national access to death, which is nice for them twice spoiling her, which then causes her to actually become a carrion lady when she comes back, but you do lose the innate caster when she turns form. As this is your only innate death access, which then you can get up through using things like Skull Staffs, it does add in another path of magic, which you can also use for summoning stuff, which is great, but it's quite hard to get her safely and intentionally, and I actually prefer the Blessed Couple, if possible. Also, the other nice thing is she does lose Berserker, so at least she'll cast and not just go Berserk and charge the enemy, which is also quite nice. Next up, we have the Harpy Queen, who's an Air 2, Nature 2, okay leader, who is stealthy, has Wasteland Survival, who can fly, as well as summoning harpies within your dominions. This is your only air access natively for Early Age Pangea, which is very good for searching. Also has a very high map move, which means that she's actually one of the few leaders that can take a very large strike force of harpies around the map, as far as her map movement can normally go. She does summon harpies each turn, which is quite a good gold saver if you want to use them for patrollers or castle defenders, and she's also one of the main ways you can increase your research through forging quills, but unfortunately she can't equip a hammer, which is a bit of a shame. Other than that, keep her safe. She's not that great in combat, she can't really use that many magical items, so she's not great at thugging. Use her air when you need to, and otherwise keep her safe, and use her for forging and some magical diversity. Finally, for your national heroes, we have the White Minotaur, who's a Holy 2, good leader, who has Inspirational 1, Berserker 5, and is a Trampling Sacred at size 4. This is a multi-hero, Holy 2 Priest, which is great. It means you can have more than one of them. You'll get more of these the higher your luck scales are. They're really good supporting leaders. They're able to use Sermon of Courage, they're inspirational, and additionally at Leadership 100 for any of your disciplined troops, they're able to use formations with them. Really, really nice. Unfortunately, they're not stealthy, so they're not really good for taking people on stealthy raids, which is a bit of a shame, but, you know, beggars can't be choosers. They can still go Berserk as well, which has the downsides we've mentioned before with Berserking commanders, but out of all of them, they're probably the ones most likely to survive just with their high hit points. But they do have decent stats. You could use them if you really wanted to, and you had a really nice bless as some kind of thug, but just because they go Berserk, I think it's better to use them more as commanders or supporting commanders rather than using them as thugs. But hey, again, you do you. And if you give them enough equipment, they can be pretty useful. For your national site as Early Age Pangea, you have access to the Grove of Gaia, which increases the growth in the province that it's in, Pangea, by a maximum of 3. So that means if you're currently at growth 2, all of a sudden you're growth 5 within Pangea. It's very nice for having a large population, which also then will mean that you're getting more tax income as well. From this, you get 6 nature gems per turn, and it allows the recruitment of your white Centaur. This gives you a lot of nature gems, which you're going to need for some of your national spells as Early Age Pangea, which is very, very nice. Speaking of national spells, let's go over some of your national spells here. Out of your national spells, you have 2 rituals. The first one is one you're probably going to be using the most, whereas the second one has some nice utility. Grove Fortress is at Alteration 0, requiring Nature level 4 and 35 nature gems in order to create a special magical fortification. This can only be done in forests, including in sea forests, the only way that Early Age Pangea can access 2 commander point fortresses. This is going to be your bread and butter throughout your campaign if you can find forests to build it in, due to the fact that normal construction of forts takes 50% more gold, so 1,500 gold. It does mean that you can't really be using your gold to construct forts. It's just far too expensive. You need to use that for your troops and also for constructing things like your labs and your temples. Fortunately, given your innate high nature income, it does mean that you're able to get this off after just a couple of turns, but it will mean that you really want to get as many nature gems as possible, not only for your summons and for kicking things out, making sure that you have enough forest forts in order to start recruiting your really good Centaur warriors and some of your better mages as well. Next up we have Monster Boar. Researched at Conjuration 5, requiring Nature level 3 and 10 nature gems in order to create a Monster Boar event in a distance province. It has a range of 5 and is very useful for casting on enemy provinces which may not have many defenders, but if you know they have good gold income, which you can get from some of your scouts. The caster will summon a monster boar and sends it to the distant province to ravage the land. The enemy player won't really know what's happening, but they may start getting events talking about a boar rampaging through the lands. The unrest will increase, and they'll have to send patrollers out there in order to fight said boar in order to get rid of it. Very useful for causing more unrest, and especially useful if you want to be very sneaky with your Satyr Sneaks and have them sitting there ready to pop out as well, but that's up to you. For 10 nature gems, it's got its place, but it's a bit more niche than maybe some others. Pangea also has access to special tune spells, which are got at the start of the game at Enchanting level 0. They're all very effective early game spells, and probably one of the main reasons you want to have your Centaurs moving up on advance and cast spells. Tune of Fear causes Fear 3 in an area effect of 25, which is a fairly large area of effect, which can frighten enemy units. This is really good for casting multiple times a turn. It makes you have access to really early fear play with your commanders. You can potentially use it to cause indies to rout, because it doesn't require any research, just needs a commander to do it. They can sit behind your troops, spamming this out, and they'll run away. Pretty nice, pretty solid. Tune of Growth is basically just a vine tangle, but it has a very large area effect, again, of 25. Very low fatigue cost, and it can potentially entangle troops to make it easier for your troops to deal with them. Again, a fantastic spell, especially if you cast this near to the front line. Finally, you also have the Tune of the Dancing Death, another 25 area effect spell requiring Nature 1, which causes enemies that fail a magic resistance negates check take 31 damage. This is a very effective spell to use either on the front line of combat to try and fatigue out your enemies, or probably more usefully against enemy thugs. It means that even your basic Nature 1 mages have some way to contribute against enemy thugs without any research, making your guys very, very useful early game, especially with all the foreign recruitment that you can do in Forest with them. Overall, 3 fantastic spells that you can really use to make your armies much harder to deal with earlier on in the game. Okay, let's move on to magical research. As Early Age Pangea, you have very good access to nature magic, as well as some earth and some glamour paths. You do have access to some blood, but it is on your slow to recruit pan, so your mileage may vary on that, and it's harder to get a blood economy just due to that. Your water power is also quite limited, but it's quite nice for some self buffs, or with some empowerment you can potentially get to the point of casting things like foul vapors. Conjuration is quite a nice path to go for. With your plentiful nature gems, you can use it for summons, you can use it to help with things like Strength of Gaia. Conjuration is quite nice when paired with your plentiful nature gems. You'll never have enough nature gems in Pangea, but the fact that you get +6 means that you will be getting quite a few that you can spend some of them on some summons if you need them in a pinch. As well, with your high nature levels, you're able to get more units than you usually would when you cast a lot of spells, making them quite a decent investment. Alteration is a really good way of buffing up your troops, especially things like Barkskin can give you some really good buffs on your troops, in addition to the fact that they can go berserk. If you use it with, say, your Revelers, giving them a Barkskin makes them more likely to take a hit to then go berserk, which can make them even more effective. Thaumaturgy is actually fairly useful as well, just a couple of levels in order to get high respect, so you can use some of your nature gems that you're getting for more nature gem income. Being able to search up to level 9 means you'll get all nature sites within that province, and if you're lucky enough to get a very high level site that you normally wouldn't be able to get, or you'd have to use a pan to find, it's going to be a pretty good investment. Also, with your glamour mages, getting something like luck on your berserkers is also pretty good. Enchantment is another good option for keeping your mages alive, as well as getting some more buffing potential, and allows you to get some thuggers out as well. And meanwhile, construction also opens up some more forging opportunities and gold independent chaff, which is fantastic for a nation so strapped for gold. Again, you have limited blood access, but you do have some blood casters and some access to a way of getting slaves nationally, which is always good. It's always considered keeping that open in the future if you need it. So what are some research goals for you as Early Age Pangea? First of all, we've got Gift of the Giant Strength, which is enchantment. It does require some earth levels, but this is a really fantastic spell for you to use. It makes all of your units hit much harder. You've already got decent strength even on your satyrs. They're higher than a human. Your centaurs are stronger as well. But being able to get large AoE buffs, strength buffs off, will make your units hit far, far harder. As the old adage goes, if you kill your enemy before they can hit you, that's the best form of defense, or something along that line. Next, I would say Howl is another great one to go for in Conjuration, requiring obviously Nature 3. Howl is going to be a mainstay spell for you to use, especially if you can use it with, say, some of your innate casters in order to get off early, as it just adds more chaff for the enemy to deal with. They will come in off the sides of the battlefield, they can tie up archers, they can tie up mages, and while they probably won't do anything, it does make a very good distraction force while your centaurs are getting in position to attack them, or your minotaurs are charging through the lines. Anything which takes hits for you that isn't part of your army is fantastic. Speaking of not taking hits, Group Blur is actually a fantastic spell for you to get when you go down Alteration. Anything that can reduce the enemy's chance of hitting you, especially if you're giving it to multiple troops or even your sacreds, is a really good deal to take. Now, usually you'll need to either use some kind of booster or empowerment, or even just some extra gems for your glamour mages in order to get up to this level, but I think it's a solid investment, especially if you use it on, say, groups of Centaur warriors. Between their defense skill and now the enemy's lowered attack skill, they're pretty hardy, and they'll be able to deal with the enemies pretty effectively. I've already kind of mentioned it, but Barkskin and its ilk, as well as things like Oaken Army and Alteration, is a fantastic spell for you to get as well. Your units have very little armor, relying on their natural protection already. Anything you can do to increase that natural protection is going to massively improve their ability to stay within the fight. Especially if you're adding this onto things like Luck or Group Blur, just anything to make them just a little bit tankier so they can use their already higher strength and attack skills in order to hit the enemy, do the damage, will be a massive help. While you don't have to worry about armor fatigue quite as much as some other races, you still have very easy access to casting Relief and Enchantment with all of your great nature mages, which can be a fantastic help for your troops who are fighting. This especially helps people like your Minotaurs, who are going to be going berserk. They're going to be trampling around, taking up a lot of fatigue, but also your Centaurs with their multi-attack and the fact that they're also going to go berserk, a lot of them, and especially your Centaur warriors who have their armor on as well, rather than just being naked. Having some kind of fatigue reduction is going to help them stay in the fight for much longer and deal with enemies when they have much higher numbers than you. We kind of already mentioned it, but having Luck or Group Luck from Thaumaturgy with your Glamour Mages is another great way in order to improve your troop survivability. Casting Group Luck on a group of Satyrs will make them surprisingly difficult to deal with, especially if you cast it on your Revelers who've gone berserk. If you've got luck and they don't die, it's another chance for them to go berserk as well, and 75% chance is fantastic. And 75% chance is a pretty good chance that they're not going to get killed by one hit and instead go berserk and potentially stay around for a bit longer. Using it as well on things like your Centaurs or even your Minotaurs can be pretty oppressive. having a very lucky Minotaur just rampaging around. They'll die eventually, obviously, but it can still be pretty scary to deal with. While we're still on the topic of glamour, Shroud of Bewilderment down enchantment is a fantastic spell for you to use on your dryads, whether they be in combat with your armies or with assassinations. The fact that they cause the target to have to do magic resistant checks in order to make sure that they're not attacking just some random thing or an ally makes them surprisingly difficult to deal with, especially when you add into that their inbuilt awe of +4 for your dryads. They're exceptionally hard to hit at that point. Adding a little bit of extra buffs as well, maybe some magical items or some friends they can bring along with it as a retinue, and they become disgusting assassins and seducers. Further down alteration, you have access to Serpent Fang arrows as well for your nature pass. Being able to use poison against your enemies, especially with your not cheap but certainly not too expensive Centaurs, is a very effective way to improve their ability to do damage. Because they've got longbows and they've already got high strength and precision, there's a good chance your arrows are going to punch through the enemy's protection, which will then trigger the poison damage. This can make your guys do a lot of damage, but you do have to be just a little bit careful, because your front line usually doesn't have shields, and it usually doesn't have armor, so there could be some friendly fire that goes on along with it. But fortunately, you have the nature pass to get poison resistance, so you could probably lose a couple of Sires. Who cares? In Conjuration, Strength of Gaia is also a fantastic spell for you to get if you have the Nature Earth cross paths, which a lot of your Pan do. Getting that extra nature level as well as all the benefits that it gives you really helps your Pan not only use less turns for buffing up when it comes to thugging, but also becoming much better nature casters as well. Something to really keep in mind: if you can cast it, it's probably good to go. Just don't cast it against Early Age Pangea. And finally, while it's not so much of a battle spell, but Blood Fecundity, up through Blood Magic, is another great spell for you to use. The main reason why is, if you're really stuck for forests and you have a high growth as part of your dominion, you can use a spell to increase the growth by 2. Increasing the growth by 2 in certain provinces, if you say get up to 5, means that you can turn plains to farmland and farmland to forests. More forests means more farm recruitment, cheaper infrastructure, though you will have to build a lab already, so it's kind of by the by. But it does enable you to have the chance of creating more forests, and as well, if you're going to go really deep into the sort of blood aspect of Pangea, more population means it's easier to blood hunt, which means it's better for you. Add this on top of your very good patrollers, you've got a fairly effective blueprint for a blood economy if you can get some cheaper blood hunters. Okay, so what are some good non-national summons for Early Age Pangea? I actually really like Dark Vines. They do require blood magic research, and they do require nature and blood in order to cast, but they're fairly tanky, they're hard to deal with, and it gives you a nice solid base for you to use to either protect your mages or to kind of use as a sort of bedrock for your army while you've got your centaurs moving around. You can use these Dark Vines in front of your commanders, or just there to try and soak up some lances or soak up heavier hitting troops. While they sit there, they regen, they do decent damage, they're generally a bit of a pain to deal with. Does mean that you're going to have to invest in a blood economy for them. I just quite like them. In the same kind of vein, you have the Vine Men and the Vine Ogres. The Vine Men aren't so much good for tanking, but they're fairly cheap, fairly plentiful, especially if you start to summon them with your Mother Dryads, and especially if you start to forge some Ivy Crowns. They make a very good kind of supplementary front line to help try and hold back the enemies while your mages do their mage thing, and you've got your units attacking the flanks and the rear of the enemy as well. The Ogres, on the other hand, are more of a hard-hitting, tanky unit. Very good for guarding your commanders, very good for just being there to soak up some damage, potentially soak up some spells as well. Really, really nice addition to your armies. While you may struggle to cast it a little bit, if you can get Fey Footfolk or Fey Knights, they also make a fantastic addition to your army. Depending on whether or not you've gone cold or heat will determine if you get normal Seelie or the Unseelie, both of which are good for circumstances. Unseelie are actually quite nice to get in that if you can get all the way up to a Fairy Queen, you can potentially get some death levels. But equally, the Seelie are also good because you can get access to air levels with them. So, your mileage may vary, just kind of go for the one you think would be the coolest. Use the Fey Folk to assist your front line or for guarding your mages, and the Knights can make fantastic supplementary force to your Centaur warriors. In the same kind of vein as a Vine Ogre, the Lumber Construct is another pretty effective nature summon for you to use. The high strength means they're very good for sieging down fortresses. They can do some pretty decent damage with their fists if they hit, and they're generally just a good bit of HP just to throw into the mix. Pretty cheap, don't cost that many nature gems, you've got lots of ways to summon them. If you really need to have something hit hard and kill big enemies, yeah, you can probably get a couple of these and they'll do the job. Okay. As a sort of stranger addition, we have Water Kobolds. Water Kobolds you might struggle to summon just due to the path requirements for it, but if you can get them through some forging or even potentially empowering, they open up a lot of strategic levels for Early Age Pangea. purely because they can sail. Suddenly, the increased map movement that you have from your Centaurs becomes even better. Put them on a water kobold, you can have them just sail across, say, some oceans if you're having trouble getting around them, or you can conquer lands where people think they're going to be safe. That's a great thing for you to do. And while you can't really do it naturally, if you can craft some shade mail, make them also stealthy, so you can lead stealthy sailing raids, that'd be a fantastic way of doing stuff, but quite a heavy gem investment, a lot of research as well. So your mileage may vary on that one. And then finally, for some good non-national summons, we have Manticores. I really like Manticores. They're a beefy unit, they can fly, they have poison, they have a lot of attacks, they have a Furor. I think they're a really effective unit. You already have pretty good nature and earth casters in your pan. I would say if you can get them, go for it. It's just, do you really want to be using a pan to summon them? You got to make sure the mage turns are worth it. If you need it though, if you need a hard-hitting monster that also has a Furor, I'd say get a few of them. Okay, so let's move on to national forging items. Early Age Pangea doesn't get any unique national forging items, but they do get discounts. They get a discount on the Thorn Spear and the Thorn Staff, reducing their cost from 5 gems down to 3, which is a very effective thing in my mind because these make great additions to anti-thugs. They both do okay damage, they have decent length at length 3, and they give you some good increases to your attack and defense stats. Out of the two, if you want to say use these on, say, some anti-thug minotaurs, giving them a Thorn Staff for 3 gems each is a very effective way to do it. That's going to do an awful lot of damage in a minotaur's hands. It gives you a huge buff to their defense, which obviously they're going to lose when they go berserk, so that's nice to have, as well as giving some increased attack, so when you're attacking things like elves, as well as the magical damage from being a magical weapon, fantastic. Plus, if the damage gets through, which it probably will, because they're a minotaur, they're going to be very strong, if any of the damage gets through, the enemy also takes an additional strong poison effect. Very, very useful against thugs who are either using magical defenses, things like Mist Form or that kind of thing, or who don't have any defenses against poison. Get a couple of Minotaur Lords with Thorn Staffs and they can make a very, very, very good anti-thug game. Just make sure not to throw them against normal troops because they'll probably not do the best. Or if you want to have a bit more of a defensive thug and you want to give them, say, like a Vine Shield, give them a Vine Shield, give them a Thorn Spear. It's pretty cheap and it still gives them some pretty good stats for fairly cheap. Okay, let's move on to forging. So what are some good items that Early Age Pangea could make? Well, first of all, we have the Cat Charm, which gives additional beauty, additional defense for 10 nature gems at nature level 2. Cat Charm is very useful for giving to your dryads. It basically means that their seduction's more likely to happen. If you do want to be able to seduce enemy mages, say if you want to increase your magic diversity, if you know that you're going to get, say, some astral mages, or if you're going to get some additional blood mages, or potentially even fire or water could be quite nice. Cat Charm is a good way of doing that, just to try and invest a little bit of gems into making sure that you can actually seduce them. I would say you're probably better off just either rolling the dice and hoping you get lucky, or focusing more on the assassination of the dryads, but that's just my personal opinion. Next up is the Dreamstone, which requires 5 Glamour gems and Glamour 1 in order to forge. This is a fantastic item for increasing your ability to research. Unfortunately, it can only be used by Glamour mages, but it does mean that if you have dryads kicking about and say you have drain skills, this is a great way of making them much more effective researchers. +9 research bonus isn't something to be sniffed at for only 5 gems. If you can also give them a hammer so it goes down to 3, that's pretty fantastic. They're a fairly expensive mage to produce, but it does make them far more cost effective if you're able to use this. Additionally, if you get a Harpy Queen, you could start making some Owl Quills, and you can also make Homunculi if you're happy enough to have a curse slot on a lot of your mages who are researching, but you probably want to use the nature gems elsewhere. Next up, as a sort of surprising addition, we have a handful of acorns, which only cost 5 nature gems at nature 1, and it just gives you +1 magical leadership, but whenever a battle starts, it will summon 3 Vine Men as a retinue for the wielder. This is obviously another fantastic item to give your dryads. 3 Vine Men being added to an assassination can be quite difficult for a lot of certainly mundane commanders to deal with. In addition, if you want to use these Vine Men on top of, say, summoning phantasmal wolves or warrior illusions or anything like that, or just buffing up the dryad herself so that she can then go in and attack the enemy, these Vine Men will give them some additional time in order to get those spells off before dispatching their foe. Next up, while it's not potentially the best weapon, I do find the Summer Sword is a very effective weapon for you to get. Requires nature 10 and 5 earth, as well as nature level 2 and earth 1 in order to forge. It gives the province you're in plus 150 supply bonus, so you're better able to do things like siege down forts and keep a lot of units alive, and additionally allows the caster to cast Tangle Vines. I think it's a really nice weapon for you to have on a support commander, somebody who's either leading large amounts of troops or is going to be there taking a fortification so you don't have to worry about supply issues going forward. Speaking of sieges, a fantastic pickup for you to get is the Spider Amulet. It only costs 5 nature gems, but gives the wielder plus 15 to their poison resistance and allows them to scale walls. This should immediately be setting off alarm bells of dryads that can scale walls. Suddenly you can just assassinate out an entire fortress, or potentially seduce them as well, all while the enemy's under siege. And it's just like, well, what can they do at that point? That's kind of insane. A very oppressive thing for you to do, especially given their low cost and the fact that you can get quite a lot of dryads out fairly quickly. Definitely something to consider if you really want to annoy somebody while they're being sieged. While a little bit more expensive at 10 glamour gems and requiring glamour 2, as well as construction 7 in order to make, Headband of Woven Dreams, either used on dryads assassinating or using it on some army thugs, can turn them into a fairly effective fighting force. It basically just causes a magic resistance negates check on nearby enemies to see if they will fall asleep, and a pretty wide AoE as well. This can really help your troops as well as you're advancing, trying to take out the enemies, because when they're asleep they won't have as much of a defense against you. And it's actually surprisingly funny to use on your Minotaur Lords when they cause everybody around them to go asleep as they trample all around them before eventually join them in a nap. Something to keep in mind, it's just a little bit late on the research tree unfortunately for construction, but if you can get there, it does open up to a play that your enemies might not be expecting you to take. Next, I'd also say a great Sword of Sharpness is a fantastic weapon for you to get. It requires 5 Earth Gems and Earth level 1 at construction level 3 in order to forge. If you need to take down, say, rampaging monster god pretender who's relying on protection, say something like an Earth Snake or something like that, equip a couple of Minotaur Lords or even just some of your Centaur Hierophants with great Swords of Sharpness and send them at the enemy. You might lose a few, or that heavy thug who's just relying on protection for some reason, or mist form or something of that kind of ilk, with the high strength that your units have and the fact that it's armor piercing as well. A little bit more expensive than, say, the Thorn Staff, but if you have the Earth Gems and you want to save your nature gems for something, it gives you an option to do it. Additionally, if you want your Earth Mages to get better, especially useful if you do construction, getting some Earth Boots together is very, very effective. Unfortunately, your Centaur Hierophants can't use them because they don't have any feet. Or, well, they have 4 feet, but they don't have any feet slots in order to use it. I suppose you don't make 4 sets of boots. But it does make it so that your Pan can use them in order to get higher up the Earth Pass. Very, very useful, especially for things like forging, for summons, or even for casting certain Earth-based spells. If you really want to get something like Earthquake or something like that out, very, very useful for you to get. While it is a bit more expensive, well, you could potentially start to work towards something like a Bloodstone as well, so you have both the Earth boosters on your Pan, so your Earth 2 randoms are suddenly now Earth 4, summon Earth power in battle, they're Earth 5, able to cast the majority of Earth spells that you want to cast in battle. For a fairly cheap defensive item, the Kitharanic Lion Pelt is also a fantastic one to use. Given the fact that you don't have that much natural protection already and you don't really have any armor, just the fact that it gives you some protection as well as the 18 invulnerability is a massive boon to a lot of your commanders. If you're going to be using some of your Centaur Hierophants, this is a fantastic way of giving you a cheap way of protecting both their head and their body, as well as giving them some inbuilt invulnerability against troops. Obviously doesn't work that great if you're using something like Iron Skin, but in the early game if you're using something like Bark Skin or something of that ilk, then it could be a good way of getting around it. Plus, 18 invulnerability is usually a little bit better than your natural protection, so it does have its benefits. Plus it's very cheap and doesn't really encumber you at all, so I love that item, I think it's great. For a really good supporting item, the Horn of Valor is another fantastic pickup for you to use. Only requires 5 nature gems to forge at nature level 1, and you get it at construction level 5. The fact that you can give your commanders another level of inspirational, if you say give it to your Centaurs or to make your Satyrs better commanders or whoever it is you're giving it to, is a great way to keep your low morale troops in the battle for longer. This also improves your resilience against things like fear spamming or morale plays as well, which can be a really big problem given that your troops don't have great morale to begin with, and you're probably going to have quite a lot of them, so keeping the morale up nice and high was a great way of doing things. Finally, as a last weapon, the Flesh Eater is a fantastic weapon for you to get as well. Really good if you want to use it on, say, like your Centaur Hierophants. Having an ability to go berserk when you get wounded, as well as always doing chest wounds against whoever you strike, can be really quite dangerous. Put this on a Centaur Hierophant, give them a small script where they're casting, say, something like Iron Skin, maybe something like Iron Skin and Giant Strength on themselves, or charging into battle with a Flesh Eater and maybe even a Vine Shield if you want to really splash out, and they can do a lot of damage. Unfortunately, it does require your pans in order to make, unless you have some other way of getting blood magic into your nation, say if you get lucky with Indies, or if your Pretender's able to do it or something like that. But the Flesh Eater is a fantastic weapon for you to use if you get the chance to get it. Okay, let's go through some pretender design for Early Age Pangea. In terms of pretenders, Pangea has access to a lot of both Immobile, Titan, Expander, and Rainbow pretenders, mostly those from the Greek culture group. This gives them a large option to choose from, and also means that if you want to try and get specific scales on them, say if you want to get increased magic, for example, then you have access to do that, as well as having access to lots of different paths they otherwise nationally wouldn't be able to get to. When it comes to having your god imprisoned, dormant, or awake, I actually think you can go a little bit greedier on Pangea. You have very good sacreds, you have pretty good expanding parties early, even with small numbers of troops, thanks to your centaurs and your white centaurs, as well as any kind of backup you might have from your satyrs, that you can actually go a little bit greedier and go dormant. Obviously, if you go awake, you will expand much faster than if you didn't, that's just a given, and it can really help your early snowball by taking an awake expander, but it does leave you vulnerable in the later game as you're kind of hemmed into only being able to really do nature spells, so try and choose a good awake expander if that's the way that you want to go. As for your Dominion, Pangea quite likes to have some candles. I'd probably say you want to have somewhere in the region of about 6 candles or so, because you're going to be recruiting quite a few of your white centaurs from your capital, so you want to make sure that you can at least get quite a few of them out at a time. Given your other scales, you probably don't need to go much further than 6, especially if, say, in your capital you're also recruiting Pan, which aren't sacred. That means you can get 6 white centaurs out a turn, resources and recruitment points pending, of course. Any further than that, and you start to get into the territory where you're not going to have either the gold, the recruitment points, or the resources in order to recruit your white centaurs, and then that's kind of wasted because you don't have the opportunity to recruit sacreds from other fortifications, only your capital. I think 6 is a pretty good place to go. You could go a bit lower, but again it could impact your white centaur output. As for order or turmoil, I actually much prefer to go turmoil. I would actually say go all the way to the bottom, go either 3 or 2. You have a +1 to your turmoil limit, so you can go all the way down to 3, regardless of what pretender chassis you choose. So there's no point taking a turmoil pretender. If you want to get extra turmoil, you can't get down to 4, unfortunately. If you go turmoil, obviously that means you're going to have additional Maenads spawning with your pans. You are going to have reduced income, which is a little bit of a shame, but your recruitment points shouldn't impact you too much just because you have more provinces than most nations in order to recruit your troops. It does obviously impact your fort recruitment, which is a little bit of a shame, but just get some bramble forts up and you should be okay. Alternatively, if you do decide to go order, that is you sinking in quite a few points, but it could be quite an idea if you're doing more of, say, a dormant or imprisoned build, and you want to rely more on your fort-based units. We're talking your Centaur warriors, or your Satyr warriors, that kind of thing. Can help you a little bit, but usually you're not going to be recruitment point locked, you're more going to be income locked. As for productivity or sloth, again, I quite like to go sloth. I don't think you really need the resources, especially if you're going to be using more of your unarmored units, and you're going to try and be winning through quantity over quality. If you are wanting to go through more of a quality route, then you want to go productivity. If you want to be maximizing the amount of Centaur warriors you can get out per turn. But if you're just going to be using more things like white centaurs for the majority of the game, you can probably get away with sloth too. Sometimes you can get quite unlucky with your starting province, and you might have difficulty recruiting all those white centaurs, but that's kind of the risk that you can take. There's no way you can really know about that before map gen. When it comes to heat or cold, it's kind of up to you and how many points you have to spare. You can keep it at 0 if you'd rather keep the income neutral, and you'll just take a little bit of penalties in summer and winter, which is probably the best way to play it. If you really do need the points though, I would say go heat over cold. You don't have any snow move on your units, and one of the better parts of your armies is their map move and their ability to get around, so going heat doesn't impact that as much as cold. Additionally, you'll be able to get resistances later on in the game when you start to get Nature's Fortitude and stuff like that through your nature pass, and you've got a little bit of water access if you really want to try and boost somebody up to try and get fire resistance, or cold resistance for that matter as well. You don't really have enough water mages to make going cold worth it. When it comes to growth or death, it's actually kind of up to you. I actually prefer going growth on a nation like Pangea, just because it goes really well with both your starting site, as well as just increasing your population. It gives you an opportunity to kind of recoup some of that income if you manage to have a decent enough game, which you're kind of hoping that you will in the early game, and it gives you a little bit of a snowball opportunity as things go through. This especially goes in well with things like your Blood Fecundity that you can cast on your pans to give you an additional 2 growth levels, which can then turn plains into farmland, and farmland into forests. More forests you have, the more foreign recruitable stuff that you have available, and additionally the more places you can put bramble forts. It gives you an opportunity to change more of the land into forests and not be entirely at the mercy to the map gen. Obviously this is going to come in effect far later into the game than it will in sort of the early game, where you're going to have to be looking for forests specifically, but it does let you transition after, say, turn about 40 or so, to trying to get more forest for you to get more bramble forest, to get more mage recruitment, so you can keep up with other nations later on into the game. When it comes to fortune or misfortune, I do actually prefer going fortune. Generally, as Pangea, you're going to be going at least 3 turmoil. That's going to be causing a lot of events to occur. If you've got a little bit of luck, you've got a much better chance of them being good events. Well, I say much better. Depends who's going. If you're playing it, then obviously it will never work. If somebody else is doing it, it'll work every time. That's just the way that luck works. Going 1 point, I think, is probably enough. You could go 2, but it really just depends on what you want your pretender to do and what pass they have. So you could also go misfortune if you really want to try to go for a hell bless, if you want to do something like fate weaving, white centaurs, for example. But you're really opening yourself up for some bad events, and I don't really think it's worth it. Finally, when it comes to magic or drain, I actually definitely think that magic is the better option to go through. It does make your Hierophant Centaurs much better, or your Hierophantide Centaurs much better researchers, which gives you a cheaper researcher in order to do some research. Now, if you wanted to focus more on Dryads to be your main researcher, you could actually go Drain to save yourself some points. It'll also work quite well with your half-men's already higher than normal magical resistance and make them even tankier. But it will mean that when you're trying to cast spells with your lower level casters, they're going to fatigue out faster, and you're going to struggle a little bit more in the research game. You're going to have to invest more gold into it, more magical items, but with the Dreamstones you can somewhat mitigate that, but it's going to be a lot more gem investment, a lot more gold investment, and it's not going to be quite as good as magic in my mind. But again, it's entirely what you want your pretend to be. If you're going for more of a Hellbless and you really need those points, then you could go Drain. But I would personally say you want probably at least Magic 2, Magic 3 if you've got the Pretender chassis for it as well. So what are some good blesses that you can take as Early Age Pangea? Well, I think you can't go wrong with the good old normal, which is Quickness. Quickness white centaurs are a beautiful thing to behold. They will absolutely chew through troops. They get 4 attacks each, that's 8 to a square. Lots of attacks coming out of a very, very good sacred, especially if you start to bring in some other blesses. Say, for example, if you start to bring in some additional attack skill blesses, that in addition to the +2 you get from quickness and also the +2 defense that you get, does make them very, very scary. Never mind if you then also start to add on some additional strength or maybe even a blood surge as well. Blood surge would make them absolutely atrocious to fight because they're almost certainly going to get a kill when they charge on in with their 2 attacks. They're probably going to kill somebody, and all of a sudden they've got +3 attack, +3 strength, additional defense, additional reinvigoration. They're horrible to deal with, especially if they're churning out that many attacks. You're talking like attack skill 17. It's crazy. Additionally, if you want to go for more of a defensive build, you can still go for the Enchanted Blood Undying build. And if you want to go a little bit crazier, you can go Regeneration. Regeneration I don't think is that bad. However, it is very expensive. That's always the downside with Regeneration, and you're not a giant nation, so you're not getting as much out of it as some other nations might be. This is on top of the fact that you have multiple nature casters who can cast group regeneration on your white centaurs or on any of your sacreds, so it does kind of impact that. But this regeneration will also work with some of your thugs, able to cast things like personal regeneration, which then stacks, which gives them 20% regeneration per turn, which on some of your Centaur Hierophants, if you want to use them as light thugs, army thugs, can be very good. Or if you want to use that with your Pretender. Additionally, as another more disgusting glamour option, you can go Awe. You don't really have the best paths on your God chassis in order to get this, but if you're willing to pay the points into it, +3 Awe on your white centaurs is quite disgusting. It means that pretty much all of your sacreds, your Centaur Hierophants and Hierophantides, as well as your white centaurs, all have +3 Awe. Makes them very hard to deal with, much better at doing things like thugging, and far able to deal with more mundane troops and keep themselves alive. They already do pretty decent damage, this just makes it far better for them. The one bad thing about this is it doesn't protect them from arrows, which is obviously a big issue that you're going to have as Early Age Pangea. In addition, things like Dread or Luck, even Displacement, the big glamour blesses I think are kind of slept on. All of them are fantastic blesses to get. The -10 to the first hit and then -5 to the attack skill in the second hit for all opponents trying to hit your guys unless they have True Sight. Absolutely great. Really love that. That and combined with their pretty decent defense skill, even when they're going berserk, makes them quite difficult to hit. The Dread is obviously very good. Now, your guys are size 5, so you're not getting as much of a clump of Dread, but they're tanky enough that you don't really need to worry about attrition so much, and anything that will make your opponent run away faster is always good. Plus, you're probably going to be going magic scales anyway, so it's quite nice to get. And then luck. Luck you can cast yourself, you have got access to some glamour, but just having it on your bless nice and early to give your centaurs a 75% chance to negate the last blow against them is pretty good, but it's maybe a little bit expensive for what you're doing. Probably want to get luck on more people with smaller, lower HP sacreds. Your sacreds are 23 hit points, so luck probably isn't the best thing, especially seeing as you can cast it yourself. But again, it's up to you. If you're not going glamour, instead you're going death, fear, as always, fantastic thing to go. Sticking in flesh is actually an interesting one as well. The 10 invulnerability can make a big difference because it really bumps up your natural protection, but it doesn't play very nicely when it comes to things like berserking. It doesn't really help that. So I'd actually probably say if you wanted to go something down these skin spells, either get bark skin, again very high cost, and you already have access to a lot of bark skin thanks to all your nature casters, or potentially going hard skin, but that doesn't quite work quite as well either. I'd say out of all of the skins, rather than going the skins, if you really want to invest the points in it, Fortitude's really nice. Again, you're not a giant nation, so you're maybe not getting quite as much out of this as some other nations, but certainly having Fortitude on all of your Centaur Hierophants and your Centaur Hierophantides, as well as your White Centaurs, and even your Dryads, it can help out quite a lot. Your Dryads and Assassinations become very difficult to deal with because, one, they're very hard to hit with their awe and whatever other kind of glamour spells that you're casting on them, as well as whatever natural protection they have, and then if they're taking half damage from all mundane weapons, which the majority of commanders are going to have, at least in the sort of early game when you're really wanting to use them to win your first war, it's going to be really good. It's going to be really, really good for you. And it makes your White Centaurs quite hard to deal with, especially if you then add in some other buffs. The main problem with it is obviously it does require Earth 7 and 7 Bless points. Quite expensive, but something that can be quite useful. As for your astral stuff, probably magic weapons is probably the best thing out of these. It does make it so that your White Centaurs are more able to deal with other enemy sacreds, some that might be able to, say, I don't know, go mist form or have mist form cast on them. And it means that you're less likely to be countered by specific thugs, of like an Early Age Calum that comes out, casts mist form on himself, he's got an air shield, and he's just zapping your guys with lightning. And there's nothing really you can do about them except hope that one of your attacks cancels mist form. Magic weapons means that you're not able to really do that, and it does help quite a lot. I do also really like Twist Fate. Just having that first attack just be negated by Twist Fate is really quite nice. It's not too expensive, Astral 6, and it does open up an entirely new magical path for your Pretender, which is also really nice. When it comes to theory on this, obviously, as always, it's very expensive, gets countered by magical weapons. There's quite a few nations with access to magical weapons built into their units in the early age, so it doesn't have quite as good value there. It's very expensive, but it already goes with your magic skills, which is quite nice. Fate Weaving, I do really like on White Centaurs. I have tried it, but it does force you to go high in Astral and take one misfortune, which I think, depending on what scales you're going, can really kill you. So your mileage may vary, but I do quite like it. Do what you want. If you really want to try and go for a more memey kind of build, you can go very heavily into swiftness and things like Strength of the Earth, Strength of the Flesh, in order to try and maximize that initial charge strike on your guys. Is it worth it? No. Is it funny? Yes. Again, do what you want. On a more serious note, I actually think awareness is really good on your White Centaurs. They're going to charge on in, they're going to be taking lots of hits, they're going to be berserks, they're going to be losing some of their defense skill as well. Giving them the ability to not care about quite as many hits they're taking before it starts impacting their defense skill does actually keep them alive for a lot longer. But again, it doesn't help them against arrows, so, you know, depending on what other blesses you have, if you've gone really into staying alive in melee but you've got nothing to defend you against range attacks, then you might want to rethink taking this one. As for what blesses stay away from, I think the main one, in my personal opinion, is stay away from larger. Now usually I'm one of the people who's going to back up larger as much as possible. I do really like it as a bless, but I feel like for Early Age Pangea, it's not what you want. Unfortunately, your Centaurs are now size 5, so by taking larger, they're going to be size 6. That immediately means that you're going from 4 attacks per square down to 2. And to be quite honest, I think size 6 is probably the worst size in the game. And voluntarily going from one of the better sizes in the game, which is size 5, because it maximizes your attack density versus your ability to actually do damage, and then going to size 6, I just don't think it's worth it. The stat increases are really nice. The extra HP, the strength, the map move, all fantastic. I think it just really impacts your ability for your White Centaurs to do your damage. Additionally, you want to stay away from blesses that aren't really going to do very much for you, or you don't have the easy way casting resistances for. Say, for example, a Chill Aura, a Heat Aura, or even something like Charged Bodies. All very expensive blesses. You don't really have the resistances inbuilt, so it means you have to get the resistances on your guys to get that around. And there's a chance for a lot of friendly fire with your chill aura, your heat aura on your friendly troops, and that's not that great. I don't really like Righteous Wrath for your white centaurs. You only have a limited number of them. While the +3 attack, +3 strength, and +6 morale is very nice, again, they're quite large sacred, so they don't really have the clump together ability to really get that buff very well. And you're relying on one of your capital only sacreds to die in order to get it. I think I much prefer Blood Surge just because it means you're going to get that when you're actually killing people rather than when one of your sacreds die. Also, please do not go recuperation. All of you guys get recuperation. You don't need it, please. Okay, let's start going through some example pretenders for Early Age Pangea. Again, these are the pretenders that I think can be quite good. Use them however you want. Use them as an inspiration for something else you want to make yourself. Again, it's just my kind of opinion of how I think the nation should be played. Your mileage may vary with my line of thought. The first pretender we have is the Awake Drogon Fight, the Drakon, who has Earth 7, Nature 5, with 5 Dominion, 3 Turmoil, 2 Sloth, 2 Heat, 2 Growth, 1 Fortune, 2 Magic, with a Strength of the Earth, Fortitude, and Resilient Bless. This pretender's pretty easy to understand. He's there to be awake from the beginning to help you expand out. While you don't necessarily need an Awake Expander, having one that's able to come out immediately, help you push towards those forests so you can really get your mage economy going up with your infrastructure bonuses, etc., and help you secure that can be really, really helpful. Additionally, it makes you far stronger as you're able to snowball a little bit easier so you can hopefully win your first war to really keep that snowballing going. As far as Bless goes, the Fortitude as well as the Strength of the Earth both help the white centaurs, makes them far tankier and harder to kill. Additionally, also makes your dragon far harder to kill, especially for mundane troops. And while the Resilient isn't perhaps the most useful of all of the blesses, it's very cheap and it's probably better than Mountain Survival. Additionally, with the Drakon, you have access to a fairly decent caster with Earth 7, Nature 5, who's able to cast you Mother Oak for getting additional nature gems if you don't want to rely on getting a pan random, for example. And having the high Earth as well gives you access to a lot of army-wide buffs later on to the game, as well as just having a very good Earth caster for when you need it. He can go out, he can expand pretty easily, pretty safely. Just keep him away from things like barbarians or very, very strong kind of independents with a lot of heavy cavalry, at least until you get a little bit of research. His protection's pretty good at 21, but enough people, he will take damage enough. Just make sure that you get enchantment 2, get yourself some regeneration on, and he should be pretty good to go. Especially when you start to pile it in with all of these weapon attacks, it's fantastic. Just be a little bit careful of the dragon gas. If you're sending out any of your other troops with him, could be a little bit of friendly fire. Next up, we have the Awake Geyser Nature, the Sacred Geyser. And he has Fire 3, Water 9, and Astral 6, with 7 Dominion, 2 Turmoil, 2 Sloth, 2 Heat, 0 Growth, 0 Fortune, and 1 in Magic, with a Quickness and Twist Fate Bless. This isn't a particularly big Hell Bless. In fact, I wouldn't even really say it's that bad in terms of your scales. It's kind of half measure, if anything. But what this does, it makes your white centaurs very scary from out the gate. The quickness is absolutely fantastic on them. It makes them attack very quickly, with +2 attack, +2 defense, and doubling their attacks per round, as we sort of said in the Bless area. And the Twist Fate helps keep alive, and it's probably one of the better defensive blesses for them, mostly because it not only helps them in melee, but also helps them against arrows. You would hope that once they manage to get in with their good defensiveness, they won't be taking that much damage. They'll be blocking or parrying a lot of the attacks, at least until they manage to kill the enemy with their quickness. So just being able to stop that first hit is going to be a big, massive help for them. As far as your magical pass go, this gets you really deep into water, unlocks quite a few summons for you, as well as also opening up astral. Unfortunately, you can't teleport the Sacred Geyser, but it does give you a really good innate caster for defending your home province. It does mean if you want to go for something like Mother Oak that you have to rely on pan randoms, and you don't have that nature astral cross path, which is really nice. But you could always play around with this and try and mold this pretend how you want. I like having a little bit of extra fire. I like having the water. It does open up a lot of things, especially if you use your water one Hierophantides for site searching, so you can get the water gems so you can start making up some more things and getting some nice summons as well. Plus, worst comes worst, you can just leave them on research. It allows you to get research up pretty quick without having to rely on recruiting a bunch of your Hierophantides to begin with. Next up, we have the Dormant Lovey Mummy Lady, the Titan of Love, who is Air 4, Water 4, Nature 5, Glamour 4, with 6 Dominion, 2 Turmoil, 2 Sloth, 2 Heat, 3 Growth, 1 Fortune, and 2 in Magic, with a Shock Resistance, Cold Resistance, Defense Skill, Blur, awareness, and heroism bless. This is more of a mixed bag of a pretender. She's not exactly that great out the bat, she doesn't really have any good equipment base, however she can be kitted out, as any kind of dormant titan can, into a bit more of a protector titan should you want. She does have an inbuilt awe, which is really nice, an awe 5, and she reduces unrest in the province that she's in by 10. That's really good because if you're going to have a lot of turmoil, there's a good chance you're going to be creating unrest. It means that, say, if she's just sitting in your capital researching, great, she's making sure that you're getting most of the income out of that per turn, as long as you don't have a bunch of Satyr sneaks just sitting on your capital, which might be a bigger problem than that. As far as her bless goes, it's kind of just like a bunch of little stuff that's quite nice. The resistances are nice because it means that you can buff up your white centaurs. The blur gives them a little bit of a boost in combat when melee. They have awareness that kind of goes with the blur, so they lose less of the defense skill. And the heroism is always nice because increased experience means that they're going to go up and level more, which means they're going to have better skill levels overall. Not quite like a hell bless like any of the other ones, but you've got some pretty nice scales. You haven't gone that deep into turmoil. You've got decent magic scales, you've got a little bit of fortune, you've still got the 3 growth, so you can go blood fecundity plays if you want, and you've got a very nice pretender for doing things like research, who can still come out and kick some butt. Also, more importantly, she is able to lead 200 troops, giving you a fantastic leader for you to bring around. She is also able to lead 200 troops, gives you a fantastic leader to bring around massive amounts of units. Say if you have a bunch of Centaur warriors, if you had some Satyr warriors, or just a very large collection of even harpies, she's able to bring them around and bring them to bear whenever you need them. And then finally, what video is complete without a double rainbow reference? The Frostfather, who is imprisoned, who has 3 fire, 4 air, 4 water, 3 earth, 3 astral, 3 death, 2 nature, 2 glamour, 4 blood, with 6 dominion, 1 order, 1 productivity, 2 fire, 1 growth, 1 fortune, 2 magic, with a fire resistance, shock resistance, cold resistant, 2 strength of the earth, 2 undying, strength of the flesh, enchanted blood, and heroism bless. Obviously, as most rainbows go, this guy has just gone for a big collection of all of the different magical paths within the game to give you a lot of magical variety come the late game. He is a little bit lower when it comes to both nature and glamour, the idea being that you already have pretty good nature, so you shouldn't really be relying on this guy for that. You can still boost him up so he can be useful, and the same with glamour. You can kind of boost him up a little bit, or even just empower him if you need to, in order to get to the level of glamour that you need for additional summons. As far as his bless goes, again, it's kind of similar to the Lovey Mummy that we just spoke about. He's got much more resistances to try and make your white centaurs tankier and more relevant come later into the game. Strength of the earth as well as the strength of the flesh for the +3 strength means they're more likely to hit and kill something in combat, which is always nice. They've got 2 times undying enchanted blood, which gives them a little bit of staying power as well as the heroism. They are lacking a defensive bless, but you can get around that by using things like group barkskin and the like in order to boost up their protection. Otherwise, the main strength of this pretender is his scales. It means that you can much more levy on your Centaur warriors, try and get more forts up, try and expand out to the forest, get the forts up, rely more on your Centaur warriors rather than just your white centaurs throughout the game. Both your order and your productivity scales let you do that more, and you can also recruit more things like Satyr warriors, which while not the best, are still decent enough troops. And then later into the game, this guy can sight search, you can forge, you can cast whatever rituals you want pretty much, as long as you boost him up. And while it's maybe not the best idea to have a Frostfather in heat, he does lose a lot of stuff due to his cold power, you're not really wanting this guy to fight as much because he's not exactly the tankiest guy in the world. And again, with all rainbows, you can go with any combination of path levels, bless, and scales. It's just really kind of what you want to do with your nation. The main thing they're giving you is a little bit of increased path variety. And with that, that's our national overview for Early Age Pangea. Maybe you can finally reclaim the woods and the forests for the half-men and the lovers of nature. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed these national overviews and you want to see more, let me know down in the comments which one you want to have next. We're probably also going to have a poll soon that's going to go out to the members and then also to the public in order to see which one we want to do next, so stay tuned for that. If you enjoy what we do in the channel and you want to support us further, consider becoming a member of the Burger Band for some additional benefits, including access to videos as soon as they're uploaded, rather than when they're scheduled to come out. But most importantly, thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this, and until next time, take care. I like big wood and I cannot lie. You... I can't use that.